And now, a passage from A History of Connecticut, Its People and Institutions, Inventions, Discoveries, and Industries of the 19th Century. We have seen that from the beginning there was a decided disposition on the part of the people of Connecticut toward invention and industries which promised domestic comfort, civic advance, and financial return. The early environment was so stern, the struggle for a living so strenuous, the wars so frequent and so exhausting, and the time required to learn about the resources of the Commonwealth so well filled, that it was not until the settlement was nearly 2 centuries old that the remarkable genius of the people for initiating large and powerful manufacturing enterprises had free play. The change of the industrial life of the state from a narrow retail method to wholesale combinations was not fully underway until after 1812, and the decade of the greatest relative growth was from 1860 to 1870, when the products almost doubled. From 1850 to 1900, the population increased 145%, and wage earners in factories 248%. With the opening century, primitive industries were passing, and homemade devices to fashion tools and clothing were yielding to manufactories which were springing up on many a stream, as Yankee ingenuity learned to change iron, steel, brass, cotton, wool, silk, glass, ivory, and clay into all kinds of goods for ornament and use. Connecticut was recovering from the long, hard strain of the Revolution, and was directing her energies to the application of power to machinery for the building up of fortunes, and the development of the rich resources on every side. The training of the plain, frugal life of the earlier days had been severe and valuable. The eye and hand of the farmer's boy had been educated in the rude and varied school of practical mechanics. Times were growing easier, wages increasing, and land becoming more productive as farmers learned to work it better and enlarge the variety of productions. Towns were increasing in size. The census of 1800 gave the state a population of 251,000. Hartford and New Haven were cities, having been incorporated in 1784, but they were primitive and small. Centers with stage connection with New York and Boston, a weekly newspaper in each, and shops with varied goods. New Haven had the advantage over Hartford in its foreign commerce, which began to revive after the Revolution. Her long wharf, 3,500 feet in length, product of lotteries, private enterprise, and state aid, was finished in 1802 and was the headquarters of foreign trade. With Yale College in the heart of the city, New Haven was moving into the front rank of the new life of the state. Her town poor were no longer sold at auction, and geese and cattle were banished from the green, which was beginning to take on something of beauty. The city made an earnest but fruitless effort in 1804 for public waterworks. It was also making the beginning of a cemetery to take the place of the doleful little burial grounds scattered through the different neighborhoods after the ancient custom. With the agitation leading to the Constitution of 1818 and the push received from that fine triumph, there came also the increased self-respect which followed the Second War for Independence. We find many tokens of efforts making here and there to introduce industries more profitable than raising corn, barley, and rye, and a decided momentum was given to the industrial advance by the passage of the Joint Stock Act of 1837, framed by Theodore Hinsdale, introducing the corporation in the form in which we know it, a principle copied in almost every other state, and by the English Limited Liability Act of 1855. The effect of this simple principle upon the modern industrial development of the world has been past calculation. With the opening century there came also machinery from Europe, and still more out of the skillful brains of the people. For some time the people preferred imported goods of more famous make and foreign label, but by 1810 Connecticut had 14 cotton mills, 15 woolen mills, 8 furnaces, 48 forges, and 4 brass foundries, besides many smaller establishments such as tanneries, rope walks, distilleries, glassworks, marble and brickworks, potteries, boot and shoe shops, tin plate mills, gunpowder mills, and carriage manufactories. By 1849, there were 50,700 wage earners, and the total value of manufactured goods was over $47 million a year. In the following 50 years, the goods increased in value to 490 millions, and the gross value of the products per capita of the population from $127 to $440. In 1909, there were 4,250 manufactories employing over 233,000 persons at an expense of more than $135 million, creating a net wealth of $233 million. Some of the earliest products of the forests and riverbanks were skins of muskrats and similar little animals, which were collected for fur and beaver hats, and the manufacture of hats for sale began in a modest way in Danbury in 1780. In those days of the Revolution, there stood a little red building at the northern edge of the village, where Zadok Benedict, the owner of the shop, and the father of American hatting, carried on his industry, employing 1 journeyman and 2 apprentices, and the output of the shop was 3 hats per day. Soon after the Revolution, other shops were established, and at the opening of the 19th century, hatting was the principal industry of Danbury, which now has establishments that turn out 250 dozen hats per day, employing from 300 to 500 operatives. There were, in 1909, 80 establishments in the state for the manufacture of hats, employing nearly 6,000 persons, and Connecticut stood second among the states in the industry. In 1793, Eli Terry went from South Windsor, his birthplace, to Northbury, then a part of Watertown, and began the manufacture of clocks. And in 1802, he began to use water power. Terry had been educated by the best English clockmakers, and he was quick to see what the people needed. He took out his first patent in 1797, and 10 years later he was manufacturing clocks by the thousands, making parts to gauge. In 1814 he introduced the new and convenient mantel clock, which soon became popular. He also made town clocks, as the one for the Center Church in New Haven. In 1818, Chauncey Jerome began the manufacture of brass clocks in Plymouth, and he afterwards moved to Bristol, where he manufactured brass clocks. 3 workmen could take brass in sheets, press it out, level it under the drop, cut the teeth, and make the wheels for 500 clocks in a day. In 1844, Jerome began to make clocks in New Haven, and his successful business led to the forming of the New Haven Clock Company. In 1840, the value of clocks made in the state, almost entirely for the home market, was over $1 million, and the manufacturers began to look toward Europe. So low was the cost of production that the first clocks exported paid more than 2,000% profit. The story goes that when Jerome in 1842 shipped a consignment to England, the price at which the clocks were invoiced was so low that the custom house officers there, suspecting undervaluation, used their right to take the cargo at its invoice value, which pleased the clockmakers, and they shipped another cargo which met a similar fate. And when the third arrived, the officers decided to go out of the clock business. Seth Thomas, who was born in Walcott in 1785, became associated with Eli Terry and Silas Hoadley in 1809 in making clocks. The following year, he sold his interest and bought in Plymouth the site where the case shop is now, and began his famous manufactory. In 1853, the Seth Thomas Clock Company was organized at Thomaston, and it manufactures annually 400,000 clocks, furnishing employment for nearly 1,000 persons. Of the 16 establishments in the state in 1909 making timepieces, 9 manufactured clocks, and nearly 3/4 of the total output in the United States was made in Connecticut, which stands first among the states in the value of clocks and watches manufactured. The pins before the Revolution were crude, being drawn from wire by hand, and the head was made by winding fine wire around the end. About 1824, a machine was invented that made solid heads by driving a part of the pin into a countersunk hole. In 1831, J.S. Howe of New York perfected a machine which made a pin by one operation. His most urgent need being of skillful mechanics, he turned to Connecticut men at work on brass clocks, and the manufacture of pins began in Derby in 1835. 65% of the pins and needles made in the United States are produced in this state. The making of clocks and pins made necessary the establishment of brass mills, and soon brass was drawn, cut, beaten, or twisted into various articles. In 1905, 73% of the rolling and manufacture of brass and copper in the country was done in this state, and the gross product was over $70 million. In 1909, Connecticut ranked first in the combined value of brass and bronze products. The tinware industries, made famous by peddlers who, after the Revolution, traveled to the Mississippi and through the South, increased to such an extent that after 1815, single shops would send out from 20 to 30 wagons. In 1850, they were carrying clocks, copper, tin, and brassware, hats, shoes, combs, axes, buttons, and paper. The use of tin soon led the way to a demand for a better class of goods, and pewter, composed of 4 parts lead and 1 part English block tin, was introduced. Ashbel Griswold of Meriden and Hiram Yale of Wallingford were pioneers, and English workmen were imported by the latter to work a metal which was called Britannia, a metal that would take a more durable polish than pewter, and the Yales became the largest manufacturers in the country of a large line of hollow ware. Other large firms started in Meriden about 1850, and the Meriden Britannia Company produced large quantities of goods cast in molds. Before long, the rolling of metals began, and in 1856 electroplating was introduced. In the early 60s, metal or nickel silver was substituted for Britannia, and later sterling silver has been much used. The invention of electroplating at Hartford in 1856 by Asa H. Williams and Simeon S. Rogers was of decided value, and the business, which began in a cellar, graduated the following year into a factory built for the purpose. So extensive is the silver industry in Meriden that it is called the Silver City. In 1909, there were 31 establishments in the state for the manufacture of silver and plated ware, employing nearly 7,000 persons, and the combined products of the industry formed over one-third of the total value for the country. In the manufacture of machine screws, Connecticut ranks first in the United States, and the Hartford Machine Screw Company, organized in 1856, manufactures all sizes of screws, from those for the heaviest engine to watch screws so small that 112,654 of them weigh a pound. In metalworking machinery, Connecticut is third in the amount of her products, and the manufacture of machines of a high grade is made possible by the invention of tools for accurate measurement, guaranteed to measure 1/51,000th of an inch. Bell making began in this state late in the 18th century, and it has become an important industry, furnishing more than two-thirds of the total production of the country. The establishments engaged in this are principally in Chatham and East Haddam. The introduction of lock making in Connecticut is credited to Stephen S. Bucknell, an Englishman who settled in Watertown in 1832 and made locks by the English methods of hand labor. The business was taken up by Eli Terry and others. Improved machinery and better styles of locks introduced, other firms combined, and in 1854 the Eagle Lock Company was formed. The company that has given Connecticut a worldwide fame is the Yale and Town Manufacturing Company, which was located at Stamford in 1869, and the flat-keyed lock known as the Yale lock is the invention of Linus Yale, Jr. This invention marked an era in the manufacture of locks, substituting a small flat key and a lightweight lock for the cumbersome key and heavy lock for the heaviest door, giving additional security against burglars, since the key openings are much smaller than in the old-style lock. This company's vault door, with its time and combination lock and its automatic bolts, gives a large measure of security. Its buildings cover 20 acres, and it employs 1,400 operatives.